content, products, results, and deliverables. I and no one here has personal financial conflicts of interest to disclose that are relevant to this presentation, and it will be recorded and posted publicly on our YouTube channel afterwards so you can access it. Could I have the next slide, please? The work that we're doing, next slide, please. We wanted to recognize Dr. Vasantha Muthuswamy, who was part of our planning committee, a close collaborator and colleague who passed away in Mumbai, India in February 23rd, serving the community until the last month before her death. She was instrumental in our thinking. I've been working with her for 10 years now, and she leaves behind a generation of students and ethical thinking and reasoning to which we are all dedicated. And we want to dedicate this seminar, final seminar, to her memory. Next slide, please. At the MRCT Center, our mission is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. We are a research and policy center looking at the ethics, conduct, regulatory environment of international clinical trials, and do that work by working with whomever is involved: pharma, CROs, academics, nonprofits, patient advocates, and others, regulators, to really address problems that are emergent in global clinical trial execution, and then not to just stop at the problem definition, but then to work to describe and identify ethical, actionable, and practical solutions, or at least approaches to those. We've been working, for the next slide, please, for some time now on issues in promoting global clinical research in children. And I think for this audience, everyone understands why we do this. Children around the world deserve access to safe and effective medicines and have been historically excluded from or underrepresented in research. The pediatric population is widely dispersed, so often rare diseases, and often the clinical trials must be conducted in multiple jurisdictions, and for efficiencies, potentially and preferably simultaneously. There are persistent ethical issues in terms of the governing principles, and we will address some of that today. There are differing and sometimes non-existent pediatric regulations for the research. There are challenges in trial initiation and conduct. And what we've heard repeatedly is that the pediatric patient and young adult patient and the family voice is not routinely solicited or included in the research life cycle. Children and young people are not routinely offered a seat at the table, another theme you'll hear throughout the morning. Could I have the next slide? So we sought through this project to identify and propose solutions to these challenges. We have conducted a global landscape of pediatric research governance, which you will hear about, but which we will not spend time on today, to identify those guidance gaps and inconsistencies and address them. You will hear about some work on commentary on ICH E11. We wanted to identify current initiatives to improve pediatric research globally. You'll hear about that today. And challenges related to decision-making buy-in on behalf of children, to think about the benefit and risk considerations that create barriers and inefficiency in transnational research with children, and then think about and implement meaningful ways to engage patients, their families, and community members, and make sure that their voice is heard. We wanted to make sure that there was diverse leadership and membership and broad geographic diversity in the work group, as well as the people that we engaged. Could I have the next slide, please? So this webinar series, as I said, was funded in part through an FDA scientific conference grant, has been going on now for about a year and a half. And there have been 5 virtual webinars informing the future from COVID-19, really specifically thinking, addressing the issue that pediatric research was, and pediatric researchers needed, or we needed to address what we learned, the mistakes we made, and recognize them, and be prepared for the next pandemic, epidemic, or other disasters. Hearing from young people in clinical research, assent and consent in the field, thinking about the culture and context and how that evolves in the context of different cultural appreciations of the voice of children, thinking about pediatrics medicine's development, and then today, where we are going to be focusing on sort of informing the future, how the work we've done together can move forward. Now, I have to say that in addition to an incredibly stalwart and patient planning committee and leadership group, there were over initially 80 people and 50 people that have consistently engaged in this work, and really representing a global context and effort. Could I have the next slide? So today we're going to be talking or hearing first from Stephen Jaffe about including children in decisions about research, thinking about this issue of what are the global standards. Then Lisa Koppelman and Gigi McMillan will talk about involving young people in research and what we're calling the Pediatric Toolbox, which they will introduce. I had hoped that we could call it a toy chest, but I was outvoted. Establishing a model to integrate children's voices into the clinical research process by Terry Lacaz, an introduction to a vision that he and others have for how to really propel hearing the children's voice throughout the clinical research as partners, not only as participants. Thinking about innovations in the pediatric research space, regulatory space, a discussion led by Dominic Karras from the EMA and Skip Nelson from Johnson & Johnson. And then I will close with plenty of time. So if we go over by a minute or two, not to worry. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to get to them anon. So with that, can I have the next slide, please? Let me introduce Stephen Jaffe, who is at the University of Pennsylvania in the Paramount School of Medicine and a leader in this area. Steve.
Great. Thanks so much, Barbara, for that lead in. I'm looking forward to talking about our work, the work of our work group on involving children in decisions about research, taking a global perspective. Next slide, please. So just to sort of preview where we're going, the working group, I'll tell you about the group that the process in a moment. The sort of core product of our work was this article, which was published online in the journal Pediatric Research a couple of months ago, called Establishing a Global Regulatory Floor for Children's Decision About Participation in Clinical Research. The authorship list is here, although the list of people who worked on it and who were involved in the working group is quite a bit longer than the writing group. And if anybody has trouble getting access to this article, please feel free to email me and I will send you a copy of it. If you're interested in this topic, I do encourage you to read it. Next slide. The process that led us to arrive at this article and at the insights that I'm going to share with you involved a working group that included 13 core members that, as Barbara mentioned, were a subset of the larger 80+ person working group that worked on issues of pediatric global research. We held, over the course of a year, 12 meetings by Zoom. This was an international, widely distributed group, and so we met remotely through the pandemic to work through many of the issues that pediatric research, and in particular, the role that kids can and should and perhaps should not play in decisions about whether they or as individuals will participate in a research project or not. And recognizing that lots of work has been done on this issue over decades, we looked for a document, a consensus statement that really represented the kind of best global approximation of a standard for pediatric research. The best thing that we could point to that was not just a statement of kind of ethical norms, but rather actually had some regulatory force in as many places as possible. And we ultimately identified the International Council for Harmonization, or ICH E11 recommendations as that best approximation that we could work from. And so our group focused on an analysis of those standards and also areas of potential improvement or gaps in those standards in light of the insights that had come out of our work. Next slide. I should note, by the way, that in addition to the working group members, there was a fantastic MRCT staff, including many of the people who were on this call, who helped with the research and organization and really made this work possible. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, this is the sort of the banner, the heading of the ICH E11 R1 or Revision 1 document, which was adopted in its final form in August of 2017. And the link for you to pull that down off the web is there. The important thing about this document is that it's not merely a statement of ethical norms, but it actually has regulatory force in many countries. It's been formally adopted by the European Medicines Agency, by national agencies in 10 individual countries across Asia, North America, South America, Europe, and the Middle East. So it has a kind of broad international force that we think is unique. Next slide. So I want to discuss 5 points or 5 sets of points that the ICH document makes and talk about our group's recommendations for how those might be further clarified, ambiguities resolved, or areas that might be improved. And I want to start by saying that I think that this is, or we think that this is an outstanding document, that we're not taking fundamental issue with the ICH document, but we do think that there's some areas where there's some potential for refinement. So each of these 5 points, I'm going to start out by saying what the ICH document, its key points, and then we'll follow that with the recommendations from our working group, all of which is articulated in longer form in the article I cited earlier. First, ICH point addresses the issue of sharing information both with participants, in other words, pediatric participants, and with their parents or guardians. And not surprisingly, there's a statement that recommends fully informing parents as the legal decision makers in a language and form that the parents or guardians can understand. And then when seeking child assent or child agreement to participate in the study, to provide information to the child that is appropriate to the child's capabilities. And it's hard to argue with those 2 points. Next slide, please. But there were a few things that we thought could be improved with respect to those very general recommendations. And I should note that the entire ICH recommendations related to decision-making for pediatric research is no more than about a page, page and a half. And so it's a brief and high-level set of recommendations. So the first recommendation that we had is we believe it's important to specify, or that investigators and sponsors specify, what information is material to the decision-making or to the considerations of both parents or guardians of children. So that's something that is not addressed. And some guidance as to what is the core information that needs to be described in a research consent process and form is important. We think it's important to distinguish, in many clinical trials, there's a combination of elements of ordinary care, as well as things that are really specific to the research, interventions that are being tested for safety and efficacy, maybe tests that are being done to evaluate those interventions. And it's really important to be specific and distinguish what are those research-specific elements so that people who are making decisions about research can focus on the things that are specific to the research decision and not to the clinical decision. And we think it would be important for ICH in any future revision to articulate that. We think, obviously, opportunities for questions and clarifications from parents or kids are important. The statement in the ICH document does not address the issue of readability of documents that are shared with parents, guardians, or kids. And we think it is important that investigators, research teams assess understanding and have the opportunity to correct any misunderstandings in the interest of ideal or fully informed consent. Next slide, please. The second issue that really gets us closer to the core of our group's work is what are the roles that kids play or can play or should play in authorizing their own participation in a research study. And here ICH gives some general level guidance that we think has some room for greater specificity. First, according to ICH, where appropriate, children should give assent. That is a general statement. And second, in a study that extends over a period of time and maybe in the transition from the childhood to adulthood, that it may be necessary to reconfirm the child's assent, or even if the child becomes a legal adult, a legal decision maker in that jurisdiction, to obtain the child's, or now young adult's, formal consent over the course of a trial. There is a note in the ICH document that the, quote, age of assent should be determined by the Institutional Review Board or the Research Ethics Committee, or by whatever the local legal requirements are. Next slide, please. Our recommendations for refinement of those guidance include offering a definition of assent. The term assent is used, but it's not defined in the ICH regulation or ICH recommendations, and we think that that would be an appropriate and helpful addition. Also, the language of when appropriate doesn't give much guidance to investigators, sponsors, research review committees on when it is appropriate, in fact, to seek assent. And so some clarification about at least what factors should go into the decision about whether it is appropriate or not should be articulated. So, for example, what are the roles of the kid's capacity, maturity? Does the prospect of benefit, the existence and magnitude of a prospect of benefit relevant to the alternatives of participating in the trial matter? Are there any other factors that should play a role in defining appropriateness? And then finally, there's this binary in the recommendations, and in fact, in many national guidelines, about either you seek assent or you don't, and no discussion of whether and how to engage children in the decision-making process when assent is not required as a matter of formal decision-making, discussions with children, sharing information with children, et cetera. So we think that there's a middle ground between either you're not seeking assent, let's say for a very young child, you're not necessarily engaging them, and a teenager or an older child where you clearly are seeking assent with a high level engagement. But what about that middle ground between the two? Next slide. A third point in ICH, here again, the term appropriate shows up, is that participants of appropriate intellectual maturity should sign an assent or consent form. And next slide. We thought, again, it is important to define what is meant by appropriate intellectual maturity. How might a research oversight committee, for example, think about whether or not a child or a group of children have that appropriate intellectual maturity? And also articulate why it is important, what is the function of a signature, because that's not the only way of seeking and documenting a child's or an adolescent's agreement. So what is it that makes a signature so important? In what ways might it be a mark of respect? In what ways might it be a measure of accountability for the investigator or research team? What are the other functions of a signature? It's not obvious from the document. One risk, just to go back for a moment, is that a signature might become a kind of meaningless formality. You just sort of hand the paper to the kid signs, and you're done, and doesn't entail necessarily the kind of engagement and discussion with the child that really we might be seeking. Next slide, please. The ICH E11 document addresses the issue of the child's right to withdraw from the research or to decline to participate in the research. Quoting from the document or paraphrasing the document, in all cases, participants should be made aware of the right to withdraw or decline. And then a blanket statement, refusal to assent or withdrawal of assent should be respected. And we thought that there were a couple of problems with these blanket statements. Next slide, please. And in fact, as I'll discuss in a moment, even some contradictions with some language that comes up later in the document. So our recommendations is that the guidance should first acknowledge that there might be circumstances, whether a child who has very limited decision-making capacity, who's very acutely ill, that a meaningful dissent, and really this recommendation is talking about dissent, but there might be cases where meaningful dissent may not be possible, and that it is important to recognize that and provide some guidance about how to proceed. Second, and this is actually the point of contradiction that you'll see in a moment, there are some cases in which continuing in a trial might actually be clearly or pretty clearly in the kid's best interest, despite their dissent. There may be a clinical rationale that a kid ought to continue in a trial. And that might be a situation where this blanket statement about the withdrawal of assent or dissent should be respected, but that statement may not be appropriate. And finally, because many research studies, many clinical trials involve a combination of elements that are really specific to the research, whether they be interventions that are being tested or measures that are being used to measure the efficacy or safety of those interventions. But many clinical trials also contain large amounts of ordinary clinical care that kids would be receiving even if they weren't in the study. It's really important to distinguish between a situation where a kid is objecting to a research-specific element, which might justify withdrawal from the trial, and objection to an element of ordinary clinical care that the kid should be receiving, whether or not they're in the trial. And that, of course, requires a pretty high level of sophistication and capacity on the part of the kid, on the part of the child, to be able to distinguish between those two things, sort of highlighting the issue of the need for attention to decision-making capacity. Next slide. And finally, I just told you that in the ICH document, there's a blanket statement about withdrawal of assent should be respected. But then following that, there's a discussion about the possibility of overriding the request, the child's request to withdraw. And according to the ICH, although the wish to withdraw must be respected, there might be circumstances in which the parents or guardians, and there's a missing word there, and the investigators or clinicians or team judge that leaving the study would actually threaten the child's welfare. And according to the document, in such circumstances, the child's objection may be overridden. Next slide. So our recommendations in response to this ICH point, first, we recognize that there's this contradiction between point number 4, requests to withdraw should be respected, and point number 5, there may be circumstances in which the request to withdraw may be overridden, and that contradiction should be resolved. And finally, there's not in the ICH guidance any discussion, or there's an assumption, or implicitly or even explicitly, the view is that it's up to the investigators, clinicians, and parents to decide together whether or not to override the child's objections. And this was actually a point where our committee had quite a bit of, our working group had quite a bit of discussion to get to our own consensus. But ultimately, we argued that there is and ought to be a role for the Institutional Review Board or the Research Ethics Committee in decisions to override objection, because granting that power entirely to parents and clinicians runs the risk of undermining the need to respect the child developing autonomy in ways that the assent requirement is intended to protect. So we thought that there ought to be a role for the IRB, the Research Ethics Committee, in approving or signing off, or at least having the ability to weigh in on that decision about overriding the child's objection. Next slide, and I think this is my final one. So broadly, our sort of key points is that, as Barbara alluded to at the beginning, harmonizing practices for including kids in decisions about research is important for facilitating global pediatric clinical trials. Many pediatric clinical trials are done across multiple jurisdictions, and to the extent that rules and practices and norms can be as harmonized as possible, recognizing that there is great regulatory and cultural and other differences across places, this will help facilitate these trials. Clearly, the ICH recommendations provide a very strong global ethical framework for authorizing kids' participation in research and for the role that kids play in authorizing their own participation. But as I've tried to convince you, these include the recommendations include several contradictions and areas of ambiguity that if and when there's an opportunity for future revisions of the document, those revisions should aim to address them. So with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and believe the plan, I will try to answer questions in the Q&A, but we will move on to our next presentation from Ms. Lisa Kopelman, who's staff and really key leader of this project over the course of the last several years, and Dr. Gigi McMillan, parent advocate and bioethicist at Loyola Marymount University in California. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. And thank you for setting the stage with the discussion of the development of your manuscript and really digging into thinking about how to include children in decision-making. So continuing with that theme of honoring, next slide, please, sorry, of honoring young people by listening to them, I want to circle back to a slide that was presented in the introduction by Dr. Beer. And that really kind of digs into one aspect of the work that I'd like to talk more about, and that is identifying meaningful ways to engage parents, families, and community members. So just a little bit of background. Over the course of the many work group and smaller work stream discussions that occurred during the active phase of the project, we seem to land on issues related to the voice of young people almost regardless of where the conversation started. And in fact, that became a real focus, or one of the focuses of this project. A steady stream of work was devoted to creating materials for young people and those who are wanting to meaningfully engage with them. And we wanted to figure out ways that we could lay out different options and tools to help elevate the voice of children and adolescents in the clinical trial and product development space. So as Barbara mentioned in her introduction, we're calling this body of work the Pediatric Toolbox, and we'd like to share now some of the materials that are included in this collection. Like with all toolboxes, when you open it up, maybe you find a whole array of items. Some things may be immediately recognizable and useful. Maybe some have utility at some distant point in the future. The intent for all of these materials is that they're meant to be adapted and used to support your work. I'll note again that the toolbox resides on our website, and all materials will, if they're not already, be included and available for you. And as mentioned earlier, Lauren is dropping links into the chat that will guide you to the website and the resources. Next slide, please. So very early on in the project, the leadership team worked closely with the large work group to identify truths that are sort of non-negotiable. And although they're not always able to be followed or adhered to, we stand in support of these guiding principles as starting assumptions for protecting children both in and through pediatric clinical research. I know this is a bit hard to see. Next slide. A few are highlighted, and although they are numbered, it's really difficult to say that one is more important or more critical than the others. Next slide, please. I would like to direct your attention to this one particular principle that says children are entitled to have a voice in decisions and making decisions to the extent their capacity allows throughout the research process. This really resonates with what Steve was presenting earlier. And this principle, along with some experiences that many of the adults on this project team experienced in partnering with young people in research-related material activities, this prompted us to develop a set of tools. Next slide, please. We're really proud to share this set of tools that's offered in the form of a toolkit as another piece of the work offered in the larger body of work. We did prepare a companion video that's sort of a how-to, maybe a blueprint to guide the work that we'll now share with you. And before we share the video, I just want to say that a lot of the points that Steve drilled down and discussed applicable to the publication, we're trying to operationalize in many of these tools. So it's one thing to say, you know, children, we should listen to children, we should include children. But a point of a lot of these materials is we want to encourage implementing by further explaining how to. So with that, I'll ask you to run this brief how-to video. Thank you. Hello, and thank you for your interest. We at the MRCT Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard University are delighted to share this set of tools called Resources to Facilitate and Support Inclusion of Youth in Research and Research-Related Activities. Whether you're an investigator, an IRB or ethics committee member, a sponsor, or others working with young people in clinical research, these tools can help you engage with young people respectfully and thoughtfully and ensure that their perspectives are gathered, listened to appropriately, weighted, and integrated. All tools are meant to be adapted to meet the specific needs of your study. So, how do we actually go about talking to children and adolescents? That may seem like a silly question, but one way to approach it is to utilize the Lundy model. This framework describes 4 components: space, voice, audience, and influence that support a child's right to participate, express views, and be heard, all as are laid out in Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Children. Once the foundation for meaningful communication is set and young people have been identified for collaboration, it's time to start talking. Engaging with young people in research-related activities, such as focus groups or materials review, requires consent and assent, just like in clinical research. This is not simply about getting signatures on a form. The first step is to start a dialogue and share information about the activity so everyone actually understands what is being asked of them. The next step is to get consent from the guardian or parent. And the last step is to get assent from the youth participant. With assent and consent addressed, it's time to initiate the conversation. There is a lot that we can learn from talking to young people. We offer sample questions related to disease impact, barriers to trial participation, understanding the patient community, and more to help you better understand the young people you are engaging with. Maybe the question of when to engage has come up. There is no single time to engage with young people, and in fact, it's appropriate to engage with young people throughout the drug development life cycle. This tool offers areas for consideration at each phase of the study and product development. The final tool offers other considerations over an array of areas that may help, including characteristics of the researcher in the community, how different stakeholders might work with young people, and considerations related to the data collected. Finally, and importantly, a big shout out of thanks to all the wise young people and the adults who care for them who have partnered with us in this effort. This would not have been possible without you. Thank you. So just like in the toolbox analogy, we know there's an array of tools for a variety of jobs at hand. Knowing that young people learn differently and embracing the need to share information with young people in a variety of ways that are enticing to them, I'd like to highlight 2 additional resources. You'll see there are 2 comic books. The first is called Sophie's Science Project, and the concept of this was developed by Boston Children's Hospital, and it was created to educate children about medical research and the informed consent process. This collaboration was extended in an effort with Harvard Catalyst in the development of the second comic book called Biobank Questions and Answers, again, developed by Children's Hospital, Precision Link, and Harvard Catalyst. The Biobank Q&A comic book was designed to help children and adults and the adults who care for them to better understand how biobanks are used in research and what it would actually mean to provide a youth sample to a biobank. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to share a collection of 7 brochures on a range of topics related to the participation for young people in clinical research. The MRCT Center partnered with high school and college students to develop these brochures. They were then reviewed and edited and vetted by our consultants from international youth advisory groups, young people from all over the US and Europe who reviewed and edited and suggested more appropriate formats and wording for these materials. This particular set is written for 12 to 17-year-olds, but we hope in future to sort of repackage the content for younger audience. And as we speak, there are a number of translations and adaptations into different languages that are being produced that we, again, will be sharing widely. Next slide, please. There are a variety of other materials and resources to support working with children and adolescents, and I'd like to draw your attention to just one more. Throughout the work group, we worked very closely with a lawyer who has great expertise in healthcare law, Ms. Sarah Ferranti, who is research counsel at Grail LLC. Ms. Ferranti, she was a steadfast and really active member of the work group, and she developed these guides that examine two discrete issues, benefit risk and issues related to assent and consent, that are specific to the regulations that guide pediatric clinical trials in 12 countries. So the information compiled has been reviewed by colleagues expert in the country in question, and as we speak, the final iterations are being compiled for comparison. So we will offer this as yet another example of some of the challenges that are faced in conducting international clinical pediatric research, as Barbara walked through in the earlier introduction. So with that, I'm delighted to turn over this part of the discussion to our incredible colleague and collaborator, work group member, subgroup co-lead, Dr. Gigi McMillan. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm very excited to talk about some of the other tools in our toolbox. So first of all, I had the privilege of actually interacting with some of these kids. And, you know, as I love my work colleagues, my adult colleagues, and, you know, we were all in different geographical places. And so we had to meet on the screen. And, you know, only because of COVID, I think having a computer screen full of squares of adult faces is sort of the same old. It is not the same old when you're actually interacting with our youth leaders. They are vibrant, they are full of energy. They're maybe a little, once they get warmed up, they're a little less polite. They interrupt you when you're starting off on the wrong tack. And so it was very exciting. It was a huge pleasure to work with our youth. So I'm going to talk about some of the kid videos. Next slide, please. ICANN, which is the International Children's Advisory Network, created a series of videos that interview children about their experiences in medical research. And in these interviews, these kids share in their own words what it is like for them to work with adults and how they feel as patients and research subjects. Each video features children from all over the world, including Uganda, Spain, India, Brazil, and the United States. And these are personal looks into the lives of these children. They made themselves vulnerable and they shared their experiences, their perspectives as they were part of the research endeavor. And again, you can feel the life, you can get a sense of how they put their heart into their work and how they feel how their participation is important. I feel it is as if they are saying, look at me, pay attention to me, my voice has weight. Next slide, please. There's another set of videos that are actually a two-part series. Next slide. This is where children talk about how they think researchers should interact with kids who are participating in clinical trials. This is not just them talking about their personal experience. This is them being content experts, giving specific advice about conversation topics, language skills, research environments, and when and how parents should be involved in discussions. On the left is the first video where a set of children from India, Brazil, and United States actually gave advice about how to set up a research environment. The MRCT Center took this first video and showed it to adult experts in the field, had these adults respond to what the teenagers said, and then these adult reactions were the basis of a second webinar. Finally, because we wanted to honor the child voice, we gave the teenagers the last word. They watched the adult webinar and then offered their final advice and critiques. This was, again, hugely rewarding and are examples of honoring the child voice in respectful and meaningful ways. Next slide, please. So several other publications came out of our work. Next slide. Yeah, you've heard from Steve already about establishing a global regulatory floor for children's decisions in research. Others wrote about coordinating international regulation on pediatric drug development, mechanisms for monitoring clinical trials, and the importance of parents and children truly understanding what assent means. So this collection of papers is, I think, the expected result of this kind of group of experts, but there's so much more. These academic papers are the foundation for other tools. Next slide, please. So I want to take this opportunity to share something about the significance of this body of work, of this toolbox. First of all, as you've seen, there are many different deliverables. There's a set of principles, there are videos, comic books, academic papers, child-friendly brochures, parent-friendly handouts. This is a conscious effort to address the fact that in pediatric research, there is a team of players, all who absorb information in different ways and who prioritize different topics. We do not pretend that each tool applies to every situation, but rather we offer a variety of tools that can be tailored to the specific needs of the researchers and participants. Secondly, every effort has been made to include the input of the children as equal in weight to other contributions from adults. These materials have been created, reviewed, and approved by the very people who will need them, the kids, as they partner with adults in the research process. It's tempting to be overwhelmed by the variety and scope of the material offered by the MRCT Center, but actually, I think this is an honest and realistic collection. Successful ethical research with children is not simple, and we acknowledge that by offering this variety of tools and strategies. So here, please listen to a final thought by Megan, one of our youth leaders.
Do you even remember what it's like to be a kid? How can I help you do a good job helping me?
Great. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your engagement with the toolbox.
Thanks so much, Gigi. And with that, we'd like to turn it over to Dr. Terry Lacaz from the Maternal Infant Child and Youth Research Network, MyCERN, who will talk to you about a vision that he is working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to briefly present on an initiative that we have been working on over the last few months with the MRCT and others. So it happens that I actually had the privilege to facilitate and participate to the part 2 of the MRCT webinar, Time to Listen, Hearing from Young People in Clinical Research, which was organized in February last year. One of the panel members, Dr. Sheila Varadan, made a very compelling case on why and how to involve children and young people in the decision-making process when it pertains to clinical research, and particularly clinical trials. A few months after this webinar, Dr. Varadan actually defended with success her PhD thesis, focusing on the Article 5 of the United Nations Conventions on the Right of the Child. And at the webinar that I think is available for viewing on the website of the MRCT, Sheila emphasized how the conventions actually underpins the importance of treating children and young people as active participants and collaborators in the research enterprise. The right to be heard, the right for freedom of expressions, the right to access information, and the right to receive guidance that enables children and young people their evolving capacity to actually understand and participate. All those rights are actually endorsed by the United Nations conventions. In our presentations, and we actually heard that previously when Lisa shows this short tool and video. So at the webinar, we actually heard on this model of participations that Professor Laura Lundy developed. Sheila also alluded to a very interesting document that I think is worth to read for everyone, a document that will be put in the chat box. It's available on the website of the Government of Ireland. And this document, it's called the National Framework for Children's and Young People Participations in Decision-Making. How to involve children and young people as patients' partner in decision-making. This framework provides guidance to decision makers on the steps that needs to be taken in order to give children and young people a meaningful voice. And those steps are organized in 4 distinct elements in chronological order: space, voice, audience, and influence. Space, children and young people must be given safe and inclusive opportunities to form and express their views. Voice, second step, children and young people must be facilitated to express their view. Audience, those views must be listened to. And of course, those views must be acted upon as appropriate, so they must have some influence. The documents I refer to include planning and evaluation checklists for stakeholders, enabling factors to ensure success, and also feedback form for participants. All those, I think, will be very helpful for researchers and sponsors aiming to involve young people as patients' partner. Next slide. So involving patient partner in most steps of drug development and clinical trial, design, outcome, and choosing the right and meaningful outcome for young people and children, data, procedure, investigations, way of recruiting fairly and without bias, consent assents, knowledge translations and disseminations. All those steps are a requirement from regulators and funding agencies to be incorporated in the design and the conductions of the trials. So for instance, in Canada, where I live, there is a case made by the Canadian Institute for Health Research to involve patients, young people, adults, and families in the developments of the research portfolio and enterprise. And this initiative is called the Strategy for Patients-Oriented Research. However, it's not really common as of today for children and young people with life experience to have their voice heard in the design and conductions of clinical trial. And there are many reasons for this lag that we heard before here this webinar. To address those barriers, several existing pediatric research networks in different jurisdictions are developing capacity to integrate the voice of children and young people in the developments and the conductions of clinical trials. Perhaps one great example is Connect for Children, C4C, this European network. They have developed training material that we can access through their websites. And they are in the process of actually developing a database where patients, young people, families can sign in to facilitate their involvement in the development of a protocol for clinical trials. MRCT, following the February 2022 webinar, has gathered a small group of individuals, including myself, who are involved in some aspects of working with young people in the clinical trial enterprise. And we were invited to brainstorm how to build on already existing networks or groups to create a sort of cooperative and financially viable global structure that sponsor, so industry or CRO or a group of academic investigators could access when they are planning a pediatric clinical trials. We came up for now, it's a work in progress, with an acronym for this initiative, I-Power, Young People Work to Empower Research. In the next weeks, this working group, with the additions of key stakeholders and of course young people, will elaborate an agenda and a scope of work in anticipations to a workshop to be organized later this year. And one of the main goals of this initiative is to explore the interoperability of national networks and groups when it pertains to support the engagements of young people with a global perspective. How can we incorporate the voice of young people living with rare disease in several jurisdictions? How can we facilitate already existing network and group to work with a global approach? It's clear that with this global approach, sponsor needs to have access to the voice of those young people in different jurisdictions. What works well in Europe may not work as well in Canada or in the US or any other jurisdictions. So there is a need for those networks to actually work together and facilitate the engagements of young people in various jurisdictions, because most clinical trials needs now to be done with a global approach and just not in one or two jurisdictions. So we envision this coordinating structure to facilitate activities such as, for instance, standardizations of process for sponsor to access to, share text for maybe contract or confidential agreements. Of course, training and education is also going to be addressed. I mentioned C4C, they have wonderful tools and education material. How we can make this material access and translatable in other jurisdictions as well. Finally, we also need to facilitate those networks to recruit and support young people when they are participating with a sponsor, an industry sponsor, as patient's partner. That raises the issue of confidentiality, honorarium, reimbursements, and other issues that I think it's important to address with a global approach. So to finish here, stay tuned. We hope to have this workshop organized in the next few months. And of course, any of you will be invited to participate. In the meantime, if you have any questions or feedback or interest in this, please let us know in the chat box or by email. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to just encourage anybody who has questions to put them in the Q&A. We are ahead of time, so we're looking forward to having a discussion at the end. But with that, let me introduce Dominic Harris and Skip Nelson to talk about the pediatric regulatory space.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, and welcome, Dominic, as well. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the folks that are participating in the webinar. Our presentation is going to be a little bit of a change of pace. I'm going to start off with a summary of R13.4, as we call it, the fourth webinar that talked about global pediatric cooperation in the regulatory space. Dominic will then talk a little bit about some developments at the EMA, and then the two of us will engage in a conversation that's sort of forward-leaning about some of the proposals that came out of the fourth webinar. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Of course, nothing of what Dominic says or what I say have anything to do with our employers. That's the bottom line. Next slide, please. So the fourth seminar about enhancing global regulatory collaboration recognized that pediatric medicine's development is a global enterprise taking place in a highly complex ecosystem of patients, parents, regulators, investigators, clinical trial networks, professional groups in a highly complex environment. But on the other hand, this research space has been enriched by pediatric development policies that have been put into place over the last 20 years. But nevertheless, for certain molecules, or for many, authorization of pediatric uses continues to lag well behind adult authorization. We heard this from Gilles Vassell, who presented the Accelerate multi-stakeholder forum approach, particularly in the pediatric oncology setting. We also then heard that both EMA and FDA and others are collaborating, and this global cooperation is a requirement for relevant and efficient pediatric medicines development. We can't do clinical trials without it being global, except in very high prevalence diseases, but most pediatric programs require a global unified approach. We heard about what's called the pediatric cluster call. We're not going to summarize a lot of these. I think if you want to look back on the fourth webinar and what's available, you can see the slides on these presentations. But basically, there's a high rate of convergence in these pediatric cluster calls of about 70%, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we go to approaches. We also heard from Marie Valentin, who's with the WHO, about reliance models, which can be used for any regulatory function. But at the end of the day, as we heard about these different approaches, the pediatric cluster calls between EMA, FDA, of which both Health Canada, Australia, as well as Japan are on that call. We've heard about parallel scientific advice where the EMA and FDA have a formal process. We heard about multi-stakeholder forums in the Accelerate in the oncology space, and we heard about reliance as a possibility. That each one of these different models serves a useful purpose. They're complementary and not mutually exclusive. Next slide, please. We then heard an excellent summary of this and some forward-leaning recommendations about how these reliance pathways, regulatory decision-making, as well as multi-stakeholder forums and patient voice could potentially work together to enhance the global cooperation that takes place within this pediatric medicines ecosystem. And I'm going to walk through some of these forward-leaning recommendations, and then after Dominic's presentation, he and I can talk in more detail about what these might look like going forward. Next slide, please. So next slide. So in thinking about these multi-stakeholder forums, one recommendation that was discussed is to enhance the linkage to regulatory guidance. Now, there were some counterpoints about how guidance can often be, once it's set in stone, doesn't have flexibility and the like. But the thought was, could there be better guidance? The second was, could these multi-stakeholder forums be expanded to other therapeutic areas and or competitive development spheres, as opposed to the oncology sphere where it's been used for the last number of years quite successfully? If these kinds of multi-stakeholder forums were expanded into early stage development, then some structural modifications may be necessary, partly because the Accelerate multi-stakeholder forums build off of publicly available information. And if we move it into earlier stage development, some of that information may not be in the public domain, and there may have to be considerations of how one structures that around confidentiality and other concerns. And then, of course, the role for professional societies is part of that conversation. So Dominic and I will explore a little bit of this in our conversation after his presentation. Next slide, please. Another slide. So when then we look at these reliance pathways and regulatory decision-making, The pediatric cluster, could it be expanded to all regions where pediatric policies are being implemented? For example, MHRA in the United Kingdom, Swiss Medic also has a requirement for pediatric investigational plans. Second, if these pediatric cluster meetings leads to a common commentary where EMA, FDA, and the other agencies write up a document, the extent to which this is integrated into other scientific advice meeting minutes so that there's not contradictory regulatory guidance is an issue that could potentially be addressed. In terms of parallel scientific advice, we heard that that 30% of the pediatric cluster calls do not result in convergence. So is there a possibility of a dedicated global pediatric scientific advice pathway where for those programs where a conversation between health authorities is insufficient to achieve convergence, where there could be a more formal process where the sponsor or applicant can engage with the FDA and the EMA and perhaps other agencies. I do know, for example, that the FDA is invited to observe some of the PEDCO and EMA conversations. Perhaps Dominic can comment on that, but some way to get a better approach to convergence on design elements that cannot be achieved in the cluster. Now, of course, I might point out, we don't know what happens if things don't even get to the cluster. So there may be other opportunities outside of the report of the cluster convergence of 70% and not convergence of 30%. We don't know what happens that doesn't get to the cluster. Next slide, please. And then finally, in reliance, we heard there's a high rate of convergence. And so then the question is, would this be an area to explore reliance processes? And there were two models presented. One is the model used in Switzerland, which is basically Swiss Medic will accept a plan from either the US, a pediatric study plan, or the EU, a pediatric investigational plan, provided it's been agreed upon. That would be a complete reliance model. The other, perhaps more appropriate for other agencies, might be submission of a pediatric plan. PIP is the European plan, PSP is the FDA plan, through the usual regional procedure, but yet some process by which, through a pediatric memorandum of understanding, that basically other agencies could participate in that region's review. And at the completion of the procedure, other agencies could have the option to adopt the reviewing agency's opinion for the plan. In some ways, this strikes me as reflecting somewhat of the new process under the EU clinical trial regulation, by which a national authority can be the primary reviewer of a protocol with other authorities and participating, and then having the option to adopt that review or perhaps dissent from that review, but trying to simplify the process by which there's multiple reviews within a region for, in that case, a protocol, but in this case, it would be a more global pediatric plan. Next slide. So I think this is where I transition to Dominic. Dominic, over to you.
Thank you, Skip. I'll try on the next slides to briefly touch on sort of recent regulatory initiatives undertaken to support innovation within the mandate governing our work at the EMA, which is the pediatric regulation. Also coming out of sort of stakeholder discussions and feedback received independent of the R13.4 Skip mentioned, but nonetheless, I think very complementary. The first important thing I think is in that regard always to reflect on the challenges one faces, and from the regulatory perspective, that is appreciating pediatric drug development as a global endeavor, as Skip mentioned, with different regulatory frameworks needed to be navigated by all relevant stakeholders. That is that we have growing pipelines of innovation which we would like to support and see patients ultimately benefiting from. But it also means that we don't want premature exclusion of pediatric developments of potentially effective products, while at the same time knowing that there will be failure at one point, potentially earlier or later, of what might have appeared to be a very promising product to start with. And with all that said comes the unavoidable point, which is that regulatory decision-making on mandated pediatric developments, therefore, I believe, cannot take place in isolation. And we as regulators at the same time need to be conscious of our mandate in that regard, being mindful of regulatory guidances and continue to adhere to the standards. We have to fulfill our role, which is essentially ensuring medicines authorized of good quality, safe and efficacious. But then at the same time, coming back to the start of innovation, supporting innovation, to be innovative in that regard and fostering a research and development environment that actually allows for evaluation of scientific knowledge and takes changing evidence and unmet needs into consideration. On the next slide, please. And with that in mind, over the past years, as part of the Pediatric Action Plan, the EMA, led by my colleague, Dr. Eggert, together with the European Commission, have collaboratively worked on several activity work streams to support the development of medicines for children, and all focusing around delivering ways forward to address some of the challenges I've mentioned. And I can only sort of recommend you reading the closing report of that action plan. You can find the link at the end of the presentation. And one pillar described in the closing report is on adapting regulatory processes, and that's something I would like to spend a few minutes on. Next slide. I mentioned that there's the need to prioritize, which also means, you know, potential changes in priorities as more evidence comes to light, or unmet needs change. And that sort of means that we as regulators need to ensure that our tools supporting that, which is the PIP, the Pediatric Investigation Plan, facilitates that. And this means PIPs need to be fit for purpose in that regard, allowing for a certain flexibility while ensuring at the same time a development path towards the target population with highest unmet need, and generating robust data allowing for benefit risk assessment. So the PIP really as a tool to fostering an environment of evolving evidence and needs. And we've published that thinking end of last year using pediatric oncology as a therapeutic area, where we're using sort of this practice. And on the next slide, I'll try to sort of explain a bit more what it actually means. So looking at innovative medicines, we see the early phase study as a starting point. Here, trying to foster maximizing early science-driven data generation using, for example, novel methodologies, study designs, potentially even across different products, so that we can move developments forward towards where the unmet need really is highest, but doing so supported by evidence. And practically, you know, considering the early phase study as an intermediate step, increasing knowledge, and then ultimately allowing for evidence generation to further inform subsequent pivotal design consideration. And I think that's important, you know, certain, you know, steps, go, no-go decision steps included to be able to discard products at the right time in case of lack of activity and toxicity to really sort of streamline development efforts in that regard. On the next slide, please, a reminder that we're still mandated to think about the necessary pivotal trial in the PIP2, which is, for example, different compared to IPSPs in the US. But we do this sort of outlined only at high level, you know, including interdependencies as key elements, allowing for innovating supportive evidence to inform subsequent regulatory decision-making as part of modifications of the PIP on the necessary details further needed, like study population, endpoint, sample size, so on and so forth, or to delete the study and consider the PIP complete in case of reaching a go or no-go decision based on the early phase data. And for this, again, to be successful for us really to foster an environment of evolving evidence and needs driven through PIPs, allowing data to be generated for prioritization, so that we really, again, move the right product forward fast into for the right patient population, we require input from multi-stakeholder meetings. In oncology, as Skip mentioned, this is done by the Pediatric Oncology Strategy Forums organized by Accelerate, and its follow-up activities, really sort of led by an academic infrastructure with the capacity to sustain and able to inform such priority discussions. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have published our current practice in that regard in pediatric oncology in the European Journal of Cancer last year, not really as an ambition, but as a reality, as you can also read in the closing report of the action plan. Again, this is to see the PIP as a plan, a living document, but not a protocol. And this approach and experience in oncology has also informed and shaped the discussions related to the stepwise PIP pilot an activity led by my colleague, Dr. Chrysopolidis, which is the sort of formalized framework now for all to gain experience beyond pediatric oncology, where this concept may be more challenging, potentially to apply. And using the pilot moving forward for us to learn more how it works and on how to adjust as necessary. And here again, have a look at the guidance on our website. And lastly, next slide, please. If I may, I think we all acknowledge that we need to work together to achieve our common objective to ensuring patients with unmet medical needs have access to authorized products without unnecessary delay globally, wherever. And we all as individual stakeholders, I believe, have a role to play in this endeavor, so that we successfully reach the top of the hill, if I can sort of use this cartoon here. And getting there, I think, as you can appreciate, is only possible and dependent on each individual stakeholder really taking up its responsibility in whatever regulatory framework we're working in. And to have really the regulatory tool as a facilitator in that regard. And this means also within the ecosystem of pediatric drug development globally to continuously critically evaluate what works, what doesn't, and why. And within our individual roles and our sort of subsequent individual responsibilities, we carry what can we do, ourselves first to gradually break down barriers, perceived or real, and improve moving forward together. And I hope that in the slides, in the few slides I've sort of gone through, that I was able to sort of illustrate that we're certainly very committed in taking up our responsibility in that regard. And with that, on the next slide, I think there are the references. Yes, feel free to have a look and read through. I think it's worthwhile the read. And on the next slide, I think opening it up to our fireside conversation or chat.
Yeah. Metaphorical fireside chat.
Indeed.
Dominic, let me start, I guess, by let's talk more about multi-stakeholder forums. So in the fourth webinar, we heard a lot about how the success of Accelerate came about. Some of the key elements. First of all, receptive representatives from the FDA and EMA, which were actually described as a catalyst for getting all of the other stakeholders together. We heard about the importance within that pediatric oncology ecosystem of developing trust among the different stakeholders. And we also heard about the viability of the ongoing Accelerate process being dependent upon adequate resourcing, in particular from non-industry sources, so it was continued to be perceived as an unbiased forum of which there was no apparent conflict of interest. And so I guess, given your experience, how do you see that potentially growing or being developed? How would you see multi-stakeholder forums sort of being expanded outside of the pediatric oncology space from your perspective?
Thanks. That's a very good question, and I guess I will probably not have the golden answer, but I think it's the first important step for me is to recognize that there is a need for multi-stakeholder discussions to take place, and that for me comes with the recognition that we have to prioritize pediatric drug development efforts. I think that's a very important first step to acknowledge. And with that, I think comes then the ultimate question around how to then facilitate and build the capacity around multi-stakeholder discussions, able to generate the necessary discourse, not only in a pre-competitive setting, but I think potentially even more moving forward into an infrastructure which allows a competitive discussions, and how to make this sustainable beyond oncology. It requires resources, that's for sure. Where the resources will come from, I don't know. They have to come from somewhere. It's certainly something which I think will have to play an important role moving forward. Also in light of the pharma legislation review coming up in Europe. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned. I mean, I had the opportunity, as you know, to sit through an Accelerate multi-stakeholder forum to just listen and learn how it worked. And I was impressed by the robustness of the engagement, the scientific exchange, the participation of all stakeholders, whether patient and parent groups, industry, regulators did comment once in a while, but mainly there as an observer, as well as academic investigators, et cetera. But it was all dealing with non-competitive, in that sense, public information. You mentioned, how would one take this into other settings? I think, in particular, early settings. One of the challenges often in pediatrics, I mean, it is if we moved earlier. It's not so much that pediatric programs, for example, that are tied to adult development themselves create complexities, but to the extent that we had an earlier conversation about what that pediatric program would look like, you might then reveal some of the adult programs, which could be highly competitive, whether it's formulation development, whether it's a modification of the indication to be able to get differentiation in the market, et cetera. That sometimes there's aspects of the adult program that would be revealed by talking about the pediatric programs quite early in development in such a forum. Not, of course, I mean, doing it as part of PSPs and PIPs, that's covered by confidentiality. So I guess I'm just curious, I mean, that's when we get into those early conversations, could you imagine structuring it in a way that you would have confidentiality agreements? Honestly, I don't know how you would get multiple companies together to be willing to talk about that, particularly if it's revealing part of adult programs. And there's also the complexity, at least in the US, I suppose in Europe too, about certain conversations being protected, being inappropriate through antitrust. So there's a lot of complexities. I'm just, do we even think it's possible to get into that competitive space, that early space? Or are we going to have to always sort of be building off of what's in the public domain? Any final thoughts on that? I don't know the solution there personally. Just wondering, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's something to think about. I could foresee, a structure where a certain group of academic experts and investigators, collaborators, sort of, sign confidentiality agreements with all the different respective pharma companies, and then, the different pharma companies just come in, share their information, go out again, and the next one comes in and goes out again, and then, the academic community sort of, forms the decision. This may be very naive, but I think it's something, we've shown it works in the pre-competitive space. So let's, and I hear, and maybe you want to comment on that, but I hear that this may not necessarily always be sufficient for companies. they might, potentially want this to sort of moved even earlier. I think it's a model and a way to think about. Where there's a will, there's a way. No, isn't that what they say?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we could think about that. Let's maybe shift to some conversations around the concrete proposals around the cluster, parallel scientific advice, and mutual reliance. So, in some sense, I guess, if when you mentioned this idea of an academic group, and then basically industry comes in and sort of presents their proposals independently, et cetera, I began to think that whether parallel scientific advice in a more formal way for any individual sponsor, and maybe we could also talk about that more broadly, could allow one to get convergence in situations where, at least at this point, conversations between the health authorities within the pediatric cluster is not achieving convergence. Do you see the possibility, and what would be the impact on resources, et cetera? Do you see the possibility of a more robust use of the existing parallel scientific advice processes in pediatrics, either its own dedicated process, perhaps bringing in other agencies into that, whether as observers or formal participants? How would you see, could you see parallel scientific advice being made more appropriate for the pediatric setting? I know it's not used that much. I know it's used occasionally, but could we make that a better process for pediatrics?
I mean, the process of parallel scientific advice is as it is. I think the question here, to me, would rather be what is the issue where there's perceived non-convergence, and what is it actually one would want to achieve through the parallel scientific advice? Would the objective be one, and here I mean the industry partner, would the objective be one would like to have a discussion with all regulators around a table? Is that what one would like to achieve, to sort of explain more certain reasoning behind development proposals, or would it be to sort of understanding the different regulatory perspectives on certain development questions? I think if it's about wanting the opportunity to engage with both regulators in a meeting, then I think yes, it's the parallel scientific advice which is the route to go. But if it's about wanting to get an understanding of what's the high level position on certain development proposals, then I still think the cluster is the most lenient and convenient and less bureaucratic way of getting that feedback. I'm not saying that we can still get better or that it's perfect yet, but I think it's personally, I believe, a process which allows quick turnaround on high level questions.
Yeah, now you mentioned the cluster. I guess part of the challenge, I think, with the cluster, perhaps, I mean, there's challenges with both processes, but some of the challenges are, in exchange for its rapidity to be able to get a topic before conversation, the EMA and FDA, the sponsor doesn't have a seat at that table. Now, I think it's fine. I'm not saying a sponsor should have a seat at that table, because I think that would almost take it out of the cluster and more into a parallel scientific advice. And then you would get a more regulatory structured process, let's say. There is the opportunity to get a common commentary out of that to a sponsor or an applicant that gives the high level points of agreement or potentially disagreement. But that may or may not be as detailed. It's usually just one side of one page of scientific advice. So as you point out, there are pluses and minuses of both approach. I guess, you know, when you think about the cluster, I mean, one of the thoughts was to try and include all of the regions. How, I mean, you know, having been at the FDA, I know the cluster to some extent is almost a voluntary process. I mean, it's not well resourced on either side of the FDA and the EMA. And I would imagine if we said, well, let's get all the regions involved. You've got MHRA, you've got Swissmedic, and I know Health Canada, they're part of the cluster. They may have legislation coming into place soon. You know, how, I mean, can we build up the cluster? I mean, you know, to be more robust, which would require resources. And I know from that standpoint, both FDA and EMA are thin on the resources necessary for the cluster. I mean, I'm not asking you to basically say the budget of the EMA should be increased to support it, but any thoughts about how we could make the cluster, I guess, a bit more robust, perhaps?
I think, I mean, it's a, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to, I guess the question is what's meant with robust. But I sort of, you know, take that I think if we that certainly there is sort of, you know, room for improvement in the sense that for example, it may be beneficial to sort of, you know, screen, you know, all the respective development discussions and product discussions on a sort of regular level to really ensure that one identifies those products for discussion and putting those products forward for discussion in a more systematic and structured way, for example. But overall, I think, and at the same time, I think we just might, you know, need to even get better in sort of communicating what the cluster actually, you know, achieves, because I think it achieves a lot, and it is able to sort of provide value to the overall sort of ambition of fostering global development efforts. And I think that's something I think everyone within the cluster is very committed to working for and achieving. But yes, I mean, you know, as everywhere, it's always a matter of starting a new exercise to make it even better. But I think we have, you know, I think we have achieved a lot in the past, in the sense that certainly within the oncology space, you know, we've tried to be much more open and receptive towards issuing common commentaries, which we share, which I believe are very beneficial, and that's certainly the feedback we've received so far. And you know, I think we're expanding that to other therapeutic areas too. So I think there's, you know, there's a lot happening already, which I think is worthwhile putting out in that regard and pointing out in that regard.
Yeah. One of the issues that came up in talking about mutual reliance is the importance of trust in establishing and building towards a work sharing model. And some of the panelists talked about enhanced collaboration. But before we have a sort of more general conversation about how we can perhaps move in that direction, I want to give you an opportunity, I mean, to comment on, I believe that EMA is inviting FDA, for example, to participate or to be observers of the PETCO meetings, if I recall, if I'm correct there. I mean, in some sense, that's a little hint of reliance, a little sniff, if you will, of the possibility of reliance, although just a baby step, perhaps. Do you want to provide more insight and comment on the extent to which communication at that level is taking place outside of the cluster?
Yes, yeah, sure, indeed, and that's what we've sort of tried to and are working on. I think it's using existing processes and procedures to further sort of enhance the collaboration with the FDA we have. And indeed, in that regard, we have invited FDA colleagues to PDCO meetings where there was an oral hearing with the sponsor. We're participating to Type F meetings as observers, which are sort of governed by the Race for Children's Act. We have been invited last year to participate and present at a pediatric subcommittee of ODAC meeting. So I think it's that there's a lot happening in that regard. FDA has participated to pre-submission meetings of PIP. So I think that there's a lot happening in that regard to sort of, you know, inviting colleagues from the other side of the Atlantic to participate in our discussions and meetings and vice versa. And I think that's actually, for me, the way to go. We don't want to introduce new processes and procedures, but we want to optimize and enhance the collaboration within those we have.
Right, and just for those who are not used to the abbreviations, let me just mention, so the Race for Children's Act is the US act that established a mechanism of action approach to the pediatric plans, which is in oncology. And I know in Europe, there's a discussion of expanding that potentially to other areas outside of pediatric oncology, which would be a very interesting development if that in fact happens. ODAC is the Oncological Drugs Advisory Committee, just to let people know that, and the Type F meeting, the Type F meeting is a meeting to do the oncology. So a lot happening in oncology, and the question is, you know, can other areas, disease-based areas, build on that experience? But let's talk perhaps about whether or not there's some short-term things that we can also do. And I realize I'm questioning you a fair amount, Dominic, about agencies, but let me, you know, talk about whether there's efforts that we can have to greater transparency. One possibility I'd like to lay out there from an industry perspective is, you know, the EMA publishes at the time of acceptance a very brief description of what the PIP requirements look like, the pediatric plans requirements look like, at a very high level, really high level, you know, to where it's useful, but of limited use to have an understanding of what global pediatric trials might look like in a particular disease area. FDA, by law, can't do any of that. So an interesting question, and ultimately these protocols are put on clinicaltrials.gov or put on the WHO site or put on, I guess, UDRA-CT in Europe to be listed. And there you'll see a fair amount of detail in terms of the primary objectives, the design, the secondary, some key secondary objectives, the sample size, et cetera. So one interesting question is whether or not industry would be willing to agree to sort of post those as soon as a PIP or PSP. Again, getting into maybe there's some confidential stuff that you don't want out there until you begin to do the protocol, but to consider posting more details or posting on clinicaltrials.gov or UDRA-CT earlier. Because in some sense, then differences between protocols in certain disease areas could potentially start to disappear with a greater harmonization, with a greater understanding of what's going on within each group. Because my impression is that many times differences in the plans that emerge are because industry submits different plans, not that the PEDCO has asked for a different plan or the FDA Pediatric Review Committee has asked for a different plan. So there's some interesting questions in my mind about how we can develop more transparency around what these pediatric programs look like in an effort to get towards harmonization within certain disease areas just by a natural sort of knowing what each other is doing. So I'm just curious, you have some other thoughts about how we could move more towards information sharing, collaboration, building that trust to try to move to a global pediatric approach. Any, and I guess final thoughts on that as we're wrapping up our fireside chat?
Thanks. No, I'd only to fully agree with you. I think that's an aspect which one should consider. And just to remind you, in UDRA's CT, you know, that there's a cross-reference to whether the study you put in there is actually a PIP study or not. So basically saying that I can't even see any sort of reason to not publish more information on the PIP at the first place. You know, of course, one would have to work out how to best do this, but I think, you know, I couldn't agree more that this is certainly a low-hanging fruit to acting on and implementing towards better harmonization in that regard. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't see any particular questions in the Q&A that are immediately on point to our conversation. So I guess at this point I'll close and turn it over.
So,
unless you have a question for us, Barbara.
yes, I do. So I'm interested in whether and why or why not there isn't greater transparency in the decisions that come out of the regulators in general. Is it because they're based on such important confidential information, or is it because they're, you know, and cannot be expressed in a way that could then lend itself to discussion and resolution? I mean, there's a reason why regulators come to different conclusions about the same thing. And even the 70% number is terrific, but what about the 30%? There must be either a scientific, ethical, or other reason that undergirds that decision making. And it's never been clear to me why we can't know. You know, we as a community can't know, because it would, I think, help the research agenda to understand what those differences are. Does that question make sense?
Yes, no, it makes sense. Let
Yeah.
me perhaps give a sort of mashup of FDA industry perspective, given my past experience, and then obviously Dominic can comment from an EMA perspective.
And just to say, Skip, is it J&J now, but was it the FDA? So he speaks with authority, although he does not speak for either entity.
No, I don't. No, I don't. So first of all, the FDA is under much more stringent confidentiality requirements. I mean, strictly speaking, they can't even reveal the presence of an IND. In other words, if you ask the FDA, did company X submit a proposal, they can't answer that question. I mean, it's
by law.
By law. And you know, feel free to try and get our Congress to pass a different law. I mean, but
to pass anyway. No, go ahead.
Never mind, we won't go there. You know, so there are, you know, so I think that's would be challenging. Now, there are laws that have been passed that allow for transparency on certain things. So, and there's transparency, but it's when things are approved. So all of the reviews under PREA and BPCA get posted, etc. But those are by law, and they're not until it's done. There's nothing that would establish the ability to do what the EMA is doing and showing anything about what the pediatric study plan looks like initially. So I think there's a serious question about enabling law. Now, there are interesting differences in every program, and it's going to vary between FDA and EMA, and for that matter, other health authorities. Simple areas would be choice of control group, depending upon the indication. The EMA may be much more open to having the control group being a standard of care, which could include potentially unapproved drugs. In my experience, FDA is not. If you're seeking an adjunctive indication, for example, in addition to standard of care, generally they will restrict the background medications to those that are approved. You know, so there are some subtle differences, and you know, one could debate the science about that and begin to explore that in every given indication. But there are subtle differences, and it can go both ways in terms of agencies having. And the way I view it, and then I'll stop there, is, I mean, if you put a group of scientists, you have 6 scientists and clinical scientists over in one room and 6 in another room, talking about an issue, there will be disagreement potentially, and then you put the 12 together where you get agreement, unclear. So some of these are driven by scientific issues that, yes, could there be better transparency around those? Absolutely. And could we get convergence? Until we try, it's unclear. I guess I'll stop with that.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, my only point is that until you get those 12 people, 2 groups of 6 together, you don't know what the thinking is or how to resolve it,
right,
or whether it's resolvable.
right,
And I think we limit ourselves by not having the information to engage in an academic, not a competitive way, in the science, ethics, conduct, whatever that is, you know, if it's standard of care, well, a lot of pediatric drug use or product use is not approved.
yes,
And yet people use it all the time.
Right.
So, you know, if that's a position, then it's something where the public could start advocating for, you know, a different standard for good reason. Our
Right.
kids are exposed to products all the time that aren't approved.
Right.
So if we want, you know, I know I don't have to convince you, but to me, it's very frustrating to, quote, be on the outside, to be on the outside of regulators and to be on the outside of industry and not have the ability to engage in the conversation for not having that information.
Right. And some of these could be amenable to a multi-stakeholder forum, potentially if they're a non-competitive issue, and again would be dependent upon, you know, individual disease areas and advocacy groups getting together and saying that's worth doing. Absolutely, I agree. So, Dominic, I guess the last word, perhaps.
You get the last word.
I mean, I couldn't agree more either. But I think, I mean, we're publishing minutes of every PDCO, the pediatric committee, every month. Also product-specific minutes, and they're currently limited to certain information. But I actually can't really see a reason to why, you know, these minutes couldn't be expanded towards reflecting some of these discussions in there as a starting point. And again, I equally can't see a reason to why not publish the full PIP. You know, of course, you know, certain confidential information would need to be redacted, but I think that's fine. But just to close off, I think that's certainly something to think about and take up.
Yeah. Well, thank you both, and thank you for the fireside chat. And let me thank all the people that have contributed to this work. You know, I think that the audience here has heard in the last 20 minutes what the kind of dynamic conversations have been that have gone on for the last 2 years, or a little bit more actually. I remember the last in-person meeting was of the leadership team around a table to plan this effort. And then, you know, shortly thereafter, COVID hit. And I have to say, it's been one of the most interesting forays into trying to uncover the really fundamental issues to spur pediatric research and to challenge the global community to find ways of working together to promote the health of children, which I think everyone would want. And it's not, the goal is not in any way disagreed upon, or there's no disagreement, but how we do that and how we can work together and how we can sort of carve that path that Dominic and Skip were outlining in the last 20 minutes or so really involves some substantive issues that we need to engage in. I think that only through this kind of collaboration with patients, and I mean actual young people at the table, with parent advocates and allies, with the patient advocacy groups, and with the clinical research networks, investigators, industry, regulators, and payers can we start to address the kind of significant issues that we have. And we hope we've made at least a start and continued efforts in that way. I also think that it should be noted that we build on the efforts of many, many groups who have tried and succeeded in part, as we have succeeded in part, in addressing some of these issues, and we stand on their shoulders. I do want to thank the people that have committed to this work. I want to thank Lisa Koppelman primarily for having led us through this ever so gently, elegantly, and in a forward positive direction. And Lauren Otterman, who is bringing real creativity and substance to the work, and will be continuing in the work on pediatric HTA, health technology assessments, and payment issues. We don't get into actual how much to charge or any of that, but some of the issues undergirding the differences in approach, such that, you know, children are exposed in the research to the development of a product and then can't benefit as a population because it is not put on formulary. We have a lot of work to do. We have lots of facets. We should lead with the voice of Meg and all the others we represent to say we commit to a future that is based in science and ethics and advocates for children through research. And we look forward to your participation as we go forward. More to do. You'll hear from the group Y Power. You'll hear about some of the work. Please sign up at the MRCT Center. All of the products, assets, and deliverables that we have will be announced. I also want to invite you to take a 3-question questionnaire at the end of this to tell us, you know, your thoughts and to give us some quick feedback so that we can continue to work on your behalf. With that, let me thank everyone and particularly the team that brought you this. Thank you.